Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. As the war between Israel and Hamas continues, protests on college campuses, both pro Palestinian and pro Israel, continue to increase. The college protests are nothing new, but what is rarely discussed is the amount of money that is spent by foreign entities seeking to influence college students. From nations such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which has given hundreds of millions of dollars to various college campuses, to organizations such as Canary Mission, which has been accused of trying to intimidate people and students who take an anti Israel position. Are college campuses becoming the battleground for political and global ideology? The battle for American colleges. Next. My guest today has been described by the New York Times as America's Uber geographer. Joe Kotkin is the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in Orange, California. An author of many books, his latest book is The Coming of Neo Feudalism, A Warning to the Middle Class, which discusses troubling trends for the middle class of America. Joe, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I want to start out with this. The issue of the influencing of college campuses, as you and I both know, is not new. It's been
Right.
done for a long, long time by folks on the left and folks on the right. What makes it so egregious about and troubling about the influx of foreign money coming into college campuses?
Well, I think one of the things is the many colleges are very dependent on foreign students in particular. This is, by the way, more true even in Australia and Canada and the UK. And basically, one of the things that's happening is we are running into a demographic leveling off and decline of college-ready kids in the United States. And college, and also, apropos of my thesis, there are fewer middle-class families who can afford to send their kids to these incredibly expensive schools. I think that I've noticed that, for instance, my millennial students who had boomer parents were in better shape to do that than my current Gen Z people who are basically Gen X, the children of Gen X, and Gen X didn't do as well as the boomers did. So there's this tremendous need for somebody who's going to pay the full freight. At my school and many schools, a lot of our majority of our American students are getting, pretty significant financial aid from the school. But if you have a Qatar or a China in particular, those two stand out, who are basically authoritarian dictatorships, and they are able to finance large numbers of students. That begins to have an effect on what happens on campus, what people think, and it also makes it less likely that civic education of the embrace of the Constitution and the fundamentals of American life are weakened. Now, that is one of the factors. We have also done a lot of things to ourselves over the generations. I went to Berkeley in the early 70s. In other generations, we had when I went to Berkeley, which was not exactly known as a conservative school, but we had conservative professors. The idea of shouting down, a professor whose views you don't like, that was not commonplace. And what we've seen is over the years is that the academy has become more and more ideologically homogeneous. And thirdly, within the left of center world, a much more repressive um, and doctrinaire approach has come. So that, in other words, many of the people I know now who are most terrified about what's happening in colleges are themselves left of center progressives of my era, and maybe even a little bit younger. So those three things are really beginning to have an impact. The demographic issue, the dependence on these authoritarian governments, um, and the ideological change within the academia itself have contributed to the mess that colleges are on. It used to be if you have a friend who went to Harvard, you said, "Oh God, that's great." Now you have to sort of say, "Well, maybe I should have gone to Mississippi State."
But let me ask you this, but is that a function of foreign influx? Because even in the 70s, if you talk about Berkeley, you talk about other colleges and other universities, the idea of protest was there already, whether it was civil rights and black empowerment,
Sure.
feminism, things of that nature. That was already there in terms of people taking over school buildings, for example, some of which you might have even seen during
I
your
did
time
see.
at Berkeley. So is it the influx of foreign capital, or is it something that actually started before the capital came in, but that the foreign capital that's coming in is now enforcing it or giving it greater?
I I mean, certainly I think you're putting it exactly right. I mean, these things were there. Again, I think that one of the biggest differences is the rejection of the idea of free speech. That's become a real problem on college campuses. And again, because you don't have, again, when I went to Berkeley, I had some professors who were very conservative. And nobody ever thought, oh, this person shouldn't be teaching here because they believe in something I don't like. Um, I mean, you protested, but you really were protesting in the large part, at least when I was there. Government policy on Vietnam was basically what people were protesting. Um, and of course, and then you also had among the African American students, you had some people embracing sort of black nationalism. But you didn't have anything like the uniform ideology. I mean, some schools in certain departments, it's like 170 to 1, uh, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences. Um, and in some cases, there are no Republicans in whole big departments. Um, so that and then I think there's also been some deterioration in what the mission of education is and what you should be doing when you're teaching. I always feel that if the kids respond with good questions and they're considering both sides, I feel I've done my job. And yet I know this from my own younger daughter, that you get some academics now who think their job, they're activist scholars. They're, it's like they're Chairman Mao's instruments, that you would have seen in China, or Chairman Xi today. Um, and I think that's terrible, because young people should be willing to and able to think about things in a complex way, weigh the different positions, and also feel free to talk. Now, I think a very positive thing is I feel that the Z's, the current group, is much less doctrinaire than the millennials were. And so, there's always hope. Things tend to be cyclical. And after the 60s, early 70s, we had a shift that was pretty conservative for quite a long time. Um, and now I'm not saying we're having a shift to conservatism so much, but I think that people are more skeptical. I think this generation, and I could speak to my own younger daughter, uh, they're tougher. Their parents went through the financial crisis, and they went through COVID. They went through 2 years of isolation, and that kind of toughened them up.
Let me ask you this then, and staying with that for a moment. Is it because with the influx of students coming in from other countries who have been, let's say, a product of this nation's policies, whatever that may be, is it because there's more of that they have seen policy in the United States, as well as opinions that come out of, let's say, colleges that have a consequence for them that has been real, as opposed to many folks who are here, they read about it. And there's a big difference between reading about it and having experienced it. Is that part of the issue with college campuses, particularly as people come in from other countries?
It depends on the country. I mean, I don't think that, for instance, the United States has been particularly abusive or could be accused of being abusive in with China. Um, I know that when I went to school, we had huge numbers of Iranian students, many of whom I think supported the regime, and then when they realized what the regime was, tried to come back here. Um, I mean, certainly although I wouldn't necessarily agree, I can understand where somebody coming from, let's say, a Palestinian background would have resentments towards United States policy. I think that would be true, and maybe some other parts of the Middle East that could be possible. Um, but I think it's also what frightens me is I see young people from these countries, and not again, not only here, but in Canada and Australia and in the UK, um, who seem to have no respect for our institutions, for our ways of thinking, for what we consider decorum. You know, I have no problem, even though I may disagree in very strongly with somebody who is um, protesting a U.S. policy, let's say in the Middle East. They have a right to do it. That's fine. But the way it's promulgated and the active intimidation, that I find unacceptable. And I think, part of the problem is that certain cultures have evolved in a way where authoritarianism seems to be sort of second nature. I remember when I would go to Russia, um, people say, "Oh, we have a free market. They're reforming their economy. Russia will be a democratic country." Well, didn't exactly happen, did it? Same thing in China. When I used to go to China, and I went many, many times, the uh, uh, people in 1982, 83, incredibly open about what people felt they could tell you what they think, and it was terrific. Last time I was in Beijing about 5 years ago, you felt like you were back in, if not Maoist times, certainly very much Stalinist times. People were afraid to say anything. I would find young people who liked what I had to say. They would come and say, "Can you come over here and talk to me? Because we're really interested in what you say." But they would never write about it. They would never say it out loud. And then, of course, you've got, the culture of the Middle East, which is not exactly renowned for tolerance. Um, and frankly, I also think that it has had some impact also on Israel itself, because you have people who've been traumatized coming from the Middle Eastern countries. You got to remember, half the population of Israel is native to the Middle East, and they have very different ideas about political economy and how a country should run and what's the importance of civic education. Which was I think that all of us, you and I are both from minority groups, but it is this constitution, this basic idea of tolerance, free speech, due process, um, not always exercised to the fullest, but I think has made it possible for people like you and me to feel very much a part of the American experience.
Let me ask you this: the current protests on college campuses today that's receiving all the headlines, obviously, is about the Israeli war against Hamas. And I want to talk about that a little bit because in your article that you wrote for City Journal, you wrote that there's no nexus yet that can be proven about whether or not money that's coming into colleges has fomented what you consider to be anti-Israel bend on many college campuses. If that's the case, what do you think is the cause of a lot of the protests that are now going on at college campuses, particularly as it pertains to Israel and Hamas.
Well,
Then the second
Paul,
question I have to
yeah.
you is then how do you differentiate between what is anti Israeli policy versus anti Semitism?
Because that's one of the more complicated issues out there. But first of all, I think there are a lot of things. The opposition to Israel has been building for years and years and years. The BDS movement, you go to Europe, it's a much less friendly climate for Israel and has been for decades. Um, and I think it has a lot to do with how history is being taught. In some cases, history is not being taught at all. I mean, when you ask kids, well, from the river to the sea, and you say, what river, what sea, they have no idea. Um, Now, that's certainly among the American students, or what I find to be the most astounding is all the gay and transgender groups who have jumped on the anti-Israel bandwagon. And you say, well, if you're gay, the only safe place to be in the Middle East is Israel. And if you've been to Tel Aviv, it's got a thriving gay community. Um, and and yet they have no idea even what they're dealing with. They have no idea what Hamas's ideology is. Um, they have no understanding of Islam, which obviously has many different variants. So there's certainly a problem with lack of knowledge, um, and and then of course you also have in many cases instruction. For instance, my younger daughter, just an expand at Sarah Lawrence in New York. Um, she had a teacher who, after October 7th, said, "I don't want to hear any neo-colonialist rhetoric," and then added essentially pro-Palestinian stuff to a class which that was not what the class was about. The class was about Durkheim, Marx, and Weber. And those three, they can occupy your time and your
The whole
intellect quite a
curriculum
bit.
for the semester.
Yeah, for sure. And particularly if you don't have any background in it. So, and I've seen the same thing with I've had a couple of cases like this at Chapman. I think it's much less likely at Chapman than many other schools. But people are educated in a way that is, which is really the result is not really education as it is indoctrination. And I find that to be not only wrong, but I think fundamentally immoral. Um, I mean, I really think that, our job, whether it's, and I'll extend it to the media, which is really where I'm from. I'm not an academic, I'm really a writer. Our job in journalism has always been, let's lay out the facts. Let's see what you think. When you're a young reporter, your job should be give the reader the tools they need to make a decision. I remember when I was early days in the Washington Post, I wrote a piece and I slipped in my opinion, and the uh, the the managing editor wrote on it, "Nobody gives a damn what you think." I thought it was one of the. I think every young reporter should have that experience.
Absolutely. I remember when I was preaching a little bit, and I did go to seminary for a while, and one of my seminary professors actually said, "No one cares about your opinion about the scriptures. Read what's there and then talk about what's there. But your opinion, really, quite frankly, is not needed nor warranted." And
Hmm.
so I agree with you 100%. But the question then becomes, the Heritage Foundation has reported that since 1981, there's been about $40 billion of foreign money placed into American colleges. Now, a lot of the critique has been coming from the right in terms of what's happening on college campuses. But then, how do you reconcile then when people like Senator Tommy Tuberville begins to parrot disinformation, let's say from Russia? So when political leaders begin to parrot stuff without seemingly knowing what the real issues are, how should we expect students to do that if they're
Well,
seeing their adult leaders uh, not doing it?
Well, I think the anyone who is getting their cues from Vladimir Putin should either be should certainly be under some degree of at least scrutiny about what they're doing. And look, I this whole authoritarian trend that I'm very concerned about and written a lot about, it's it happens to be being driven predominantly by the left, in part because the left controls, if you want to call it the left, and I'll we can get into that discussion in a second. Um, but the sort of progressive left of today, they they are dominant in Hollywood, they're dominant in the mainstream media, they're dominant in the universities. Conservatives can complain all they want, but they don't have any power. But I do think that part of what's happening, and it's very frightening to me, and it has some resonance with things in the past, is as the progressive agenda has become more extreme, more strident, more contemptuous of ordinary people, if you will. There's a grassroots rebellion on the right. Now, not some of it's fine, but for instance, in Germany, you have the AfD party where there's certainly factions there that are would have to be described as neo-Nazi. Uh, there are parts of the American right who at times I read their stuff and they say, I don't want these people in power either. Um, I mean, what we've had is we've had the extremes acting on both sides and then stimulating each other to create an intolerant atmosphere. And there you even have the circumstance where I read an article in one of the progressive publications saying, "Well, people, you shouldn't have friends who voted for Trump." Really? I shouldn't have friends who voted for Trump? I didn't vote for Trump, but does that mean that I'm never going to talk to anybody who doesn't share my point of view? Um, I think that is a big problem, and I think that culture of uh, of sort of bifurcation between good and bad, and what's right and what's wrong, becomes so extreme that you can't really have a conversation anymore. I have a long career, and I used to publish in mainstream media. I don't think my views have changed very much. Um, I used to publish in mainstream media when I had my last book, which has done exceedingly well, but it might as well not have been published as far as the mainstream media was concerned. I got terrific coverage in the conservative media, and interestingly enough, terrific coverage overseas. Um, but and it's out in Japanese, Chinese, and Arabic, so I'm very happy about that. Um, but today it's very difficult to be an independent voice. It's very difficult to say, I disagree with this that President Biden's doing, but I actually kind of support this part. Um, the sort of nuance, which is really where the world is, as the world is not black and white, it's gray. There's a complexity to everything. And when I was in Israel several years ago, I was more than happy. I was a guest of at a at a very good dinner in East Jerusalem with people from the PLO. And I didn't agree with them, but it was a reasonable discussion. I learned something. Hopefully, they learned something. That's become harder and harder to do. And it pains me because you know my 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 assistant is Muslim. My social media guy was from Pakistan. I've co-authored papers with another person from Iran. Um, and I think we're creating an atmosphere where that is harder to do.
Then the question then is, how do you create the mitigating force that kind of pushes back against the extremes? And I do see some of that in various places. And, since the war started between Israel and Hamas, I've spoken to people from the Israeli Defense Force. I've spoken to Miti Raheb, who is a prominent theologian out of the West Bank, who's Palestinian, and spoken to people from the New School who are of Jewish descent. And there is a sense, even though everyone will have their own talking points, but there is a consensus in terms of how do we resolve this issue. And there is something I always think that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So let's agree on that. You can also agree that perhaps what Israel is doing in terms of the war now is over the top. You can agree on those things and still sit at the table and try to find a solution out of this. So my question to you is, and you've been around a long time, you've been in the mainstream media, how do you bring those forces together from both sides so that they can drown out the extreme noise? How does that happen?
I think it has to start, frankly, well before college. I find that the kids now come into school with almost no knowledge of the American history. Um, I mean, sometimes you'll hear, well, things haven't gotten any better for African Americans since 1865. I kind of think that's probably not the case.
Well,
Um, you know, um, I think, I always say to them, what happens if you had somebody in a time capsule from 1870 and you put them in America today? I think they would be astounded by the progress made by Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, Jews, of course, um, and the tremendous progress made by women. So, but we have to understand we were here and now we're here, and it has been a bumpy path, and there's back and forth. And then, really important is the lack of a civic education. The idea, here's the Constitution, this is why this is there. Like I had one student say to me once, it was the Electoral College was created to preserve slavery. And I said, well, that's just not true. The Electoral College was put in by small states worried that they would have no power if it was just popular vote. Um, and which was the state that pushed the original Electoral College proposal? One of them by far was Connecticut, which was, had one of the more enlightened policies on issues of slavery. And also, small southern states were there as well. And who was the big kahuna at that time was Virginia, which would have been perfectly happy to have a open vote because Virginia had the numbers.
What do you say though? Because there are historians who would take the opposite view that you gave, staying with the Electoral College for a minute. Um, Doris Kearns Goodwin, people like that, Michael Beschloss, who would say the opposite, that the Electoral College, for example, was created to make sure that the slave states were not overrun.
I
But
I, I
but my
think that I don't think I cannot believe that anyone who has studied the history would have thought that was the primary motivation. I think the primary motivation was small states wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be ignored. Again, you look at Connecticut, Rhode Island, as two states that pushed for the Electoral College. They were certainly not on, the pro-slavery side. So I just think that what we sometimes make the mistake of, we reinterpret the past with the mentalities of the present. And I try to study history not just that way, but also by what it was like. Weirdly enough, I had 7 years of Latin. And so I was able to read, Tacitus in the original, or and that exposure to being like, if you read Caesar's commentaries, whatever you might think about Caesar, what an experience. Put yourself in the mindset of that particular person. Understand what was the world that they were growing up in, and not to judge it by standards that apply for 250 years later. Um, I mean, I think like the 1619 program was just hopelessly distorted. And by the way, the best critiques of 1619 came from the left, from socialists, who said, "Look, you're ignoring the role of abolitionists. Your role, as Karl Marx wrote about in the when he was writing for the Tribune of all things. Um, Marx made the point. He said the North was going to win because had all the economic power, and that the economy, yes, the being cut off from cotton and the slave economy that was dependent on it hurt, but it didn't stop the North from completely destroying the South. I mean, we did many things that are, the northern side, because I identified with the northern side in that conflict, growing up in New York, of course, and, you didn't grow up far from Grant's tomb. You have to think, well, we had, it's like to talk about those hundreds of thousands of young men who died in large part to end slavery and then give them no credit at all, I think it is terrible. And so I think that really we really need to have an immersion, certainly in American civics and historical culture at all. Like, if you studied something I did, like Confucianism, then all of a sudden things that China's doing make sense to you. You understand where it's coming from. Or if you learn the history of the Middle East, and you realize the reasons for the resentment. One, because the Islamic states were the most advanced, certainly compared to Europe. For a long period, they lost power. They were essentially exploited and then occupied by European powers. You can't understand the resentment unless you know the history.
And I think we would both agree on that. But my question to you would be, going back to college campuses for a minute in terms of what is taught on campuses, but also prior to that, high school, junior high school, elementary school. And part of that, even if you take the 1619 project with its deficiencies, but then you still had folks who would say, like Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, who could not name the reason for the Civil War, even
That
though
was
her
one of the
state
stupidest things I've
would.
ever seen.
And but these are things that do happen, and people notice that, or the banning of books by certain communities within Virginia, or even even within Florida. The people see this as an affront to who they are.
Well,
And so the question is, and it goes back to what we were saying before, then how do you create that mitigating force that acknowledges, for example, the United States, let's say, as a great nation, but with warts? And it
that's
seems as
just
though,
like all of us.
just like all of us, and it seems as though there is a movement to try to hide the warts on one side, and a movement to talk about nothing but the warts on the other side. So the question is, how do you bring the two, how do you create synergy between the two, and to say, in spite of the warts?
Exactly.
So how does that
I
happen though?
Well, I think you again, the knowledge is key. Knowing the great things that the country did, but also acknowledging the other parts. I mean, on the book banning, I've looked a lot into that. Most of the book banning is actually happening on the left, not in the sense because they have control of the curriculum in many places.
Maya
There are
Angelou is
books
not
like
from the left.
what?
Maya Angelou is not from the left.
No, but they're also eliminating. I mean, whole parts of history are just they
Mm-hmm.
just don't exist anymore. Who reads in high school. Some of the more, I'll give you, like, for instance, you have people saying you shouldn't read Mark Twain, even though Mark Twain was very liberal, but he used language as it actually was being used at the time that he was coming. He was there. There are schools where you would never be exposed to anything other than progressive ideology. You'd never hear anything. I mean, like, for instance, in African American history, and I actually taught briefly a class on African American history at a school at a church in South LA. And, I try to say, well, look, but here's here's the history. There are tremendous things to be proud of. I was thinking particularly about John Sibley Butler's work. There were people like Booker T. Washington. You could make a fun of him, but what he did was actually very concrete and very helpful. And obviously, I would argue for minority and working class people in particular, the idea of learning a usable skill is still a lot better than learning how to shout loudly. So that other words, that there are these dichotomies that you need to know both sides, and then you can shade one way or the other. I mean, what bothers me is, and I've experienced it personally, is if your ideas are not accepted by the if you want to call it the progressive aristocracy or autocracy, you just don't exist anymore. I used to like it when I would write something and people on the right and the left, particularly on the left, would say, oh, no, he's wrong and here's why, and I want to make a complaint. The new idea is you just stop existing. You never happened. You never, what you wrote about just had you might as well have not written it. Now, the good news about this form of media that we're using right now is your listeners are going to make up their own mind. They're going to listen to your show and say, hey, that guy, he's a crackpot, or he said some really interesting things. And it doesn't depend on who the cadres in the New York Times and Washington Post newsroom would say. I have to say, I am so shocked by what's happened to journalism. As an old journalist myself, I can't even recognize what it is now. And by the way, the Washington Post was not a conservative newspaper when I was there. The New York Times was not a conservative newspaper, but it wasn't a newspaper where the staff found any sort of conservative idea or anything that they thought was a conservative idea as being something beyond the pale. And again, if you read the
But
recent,
let me ask you this though,
yeah,
because there is you are making a great point in turn, because the inability to have different viewpoints, and I haven't seen institution be able to do that for a long, long time. It's either one way or the other, and I think you're absolutely correct. But I also have to say that for some of the folks that I listen to, their ideas can sometimes be turned into policy. I appreciated reading William Buckley's God and Man at Yale,
yes.
but I have a lot of problem with his article, Why the South Must Prevail. And you can look at that and say, but if that kind of thinking prevails, that does not bode well for folks like myself or people who may be of certain ideologies when it came to the Jewish population, for example, and some of the things that they may be saying. But there are, and I think what we've lost is the ability to filter out the extremes.
And,
And
and
that's a problem, I think, for students and how we grow up and how we talk to each other. But I also don't want to make the mistake to think that we were more civil going back, many, many years. Remember in the 60s, we lost both Kennedys, King, Malcolm, Medgar. It was a violent time without all the influx of money coming in. So,
the money coming in is just accelerated what was already happening, and provided institutional support for more extreme points of view. The problem, of course, is most democracies do not have these kinds of programs. I mean, most of the, I've had many Indian students, but most of they're sent by their parents. And India, although tending a little too authoritarian now, is an infinitely freer society than China is. Um, but when you have a very strict dictatorship, that's sending its students abroad and in some cases monitoring them while they're there, we've had cases of this in Australia and Canada, I know for sure, with Chinese agents essentially monitoring people. And of course, you have this problem. I have very close friends who are, let's say they're Iranian or they're Chinese, and they are incredibly unwilling to speak out on issues because if they have family back home, they're going to be in serious trouble. On the other hand, if you're in the United Kingdom or Canada, Australia, US, you people could say nasty things about you. The people could write nasty editorials, but there's probably not going to be a knock at the door in the middle of the night.
I think that is absolutely true. But I want to go to the point still that I'm not sure things have changed all that much. I think you're absolutely right that the money has exacerbated what was already there. But we do have these strands of thought. Like even when you talked about Booker T. Washington, well, the fact of the matter is, in most circles in the African American community, Booker T has been dismissed,
Right.
and he was dismissed by many of his contemporaries, like W. E.
With Du
Du
Bois.
Bois.
Right.
So, and while we accepted the notion of learning a skill, the idea of giving up your right with his Atlanta Compromise speech was seen as anathema to a lot of people.
And
So
and I understand that. I just think when you look at what Washington did, the idea of self-reliance, learning skills, I think that's a big part of it. And by the way, there are some consistencies even with Garvey or uh, with the Muslims, the Black Muslims, and the Panthers were a little different. I have more intimate connection to Panthers just because of where I was and what I was doing. That I interacted with them. But the idea of self-sufficiency, of not looking to the person you consider your oppressor to be your savior. You have to be your own savior. And if I can say, one of the things that 3,000 years of existence and at least 2,000 years of pretty consistent discrimination, you learn the Jews, when we're at our best, we know um, that we have to depend on ourselves, and it's our internal uh, uh, mechanisms that save us. And I found very interestingly enough that when I wrote the book Tribes, which talked a lot about this type of thing, I got a terrific reception from African American groups. I was on Tony Brown. I always used to say I had the world record for a white guy on Tony Brown. Um, and I think that there is this idea that fundamentally you have to, a group or an individual has to be reliant upon themselves or on that. I think that's just the way the world is. And what you don't want to do is leave yourself in a situation where you are dependent on people who may not like you very much. Um,
absolutely, but you have to have both,
that's right. And I think,
and and
you
that was
need
one
to have,
reason
like, for
why.
instance, I would say and I, if you want to tackle the Latino issue down the road, um, Latinos in some ways have done some great things on the self-resiliency side. Their political influence isn't remotely what it should be given the size of the population. Um, no, so I think that every group that wants to succeed has got to have a political strategy, but also an economic self-sufficiency strategy. Um, and some groups, have one or the other and not both.
And there, I think, is you're absolutely correct. You need both, and I think for many people, Washington gave up one, and so one was accepted, but and I think Du Bois was the same way. He believed that you needed both, and so, but the question is that the folks, and going back to our original premise of this segment, in terms of college campuses, it seems as though people feel that they're not being listened to. So if you take a lot of the Palestinian groups, you take the Muslims out of Michigan right now, who are quite frankly mad as hell at Joe Biden because they feel that they're not being listened to. And the other part about it is that they understand that policies that are being brought out or conversations lead to policies that are harmful to them. And it could be that their thinking is that if you are in the dominant culture and you can create these policies that don't benefit me, I only have one way to respond to that. So the question to you, given your experience, given your connections, then how do you then begin to say to folk, there is a way to do this to make it work for you, to make your viewpoints known without, censoring somebody else from having theirs?
Well, I think the key thing is a civility at the very beginning. And I also think that you have to examine your positions and say, there are aspects of, let's say, take Israel. I think the idea of the settlements is insane. I mean, it's just insane. You're just burning the possibility of there being peace. Um, I've had arguments with rabbis, people I'm close to, saying, look, they say, well, why shouldn't Jews be able to settle in any place in Judea and Samaria? I said, well, you know what? This is life. Just like we're going to ask the Palestinians, you're going to have to accept that the Jews are there. You have to accept that the Arabs are there, and you have to accept that there are going to be political ramifications if you keep trying to essentially expand into areas that have been traditionally Palestinian. Similarly, and that debate, by the way, goes on in Israel all the time. In terms of the Muslim community, I would like to have seen some more denunciations of what Hamas did to start with. When Hamas did what it did, and the next day, oh, we have to have a ceasefire. What are you talking about? It would be like the day after Pearl Harbor, we're gonna have a ceasefire with Japan. I don't think that's the way it works. Um, and I think both sides, I mean, I would love to see thoughtful Muslims talk about this thing. I have friends I could talk to about it, but nobody seems to be willing to say anything publicly. And I will say, as messed up as the Jewish community can be, those debates do take place, and there are all different sorts of points of view, and they're not censored. They're very open. Not It's not always very cordial, but I think that is something that I think the Muslim community needs to think about. I mean, I would like, as I asked my former social media guy, who's now been replaced by, because we're doing more video now. But um, you know, he says, look, what Hamas did is un-Islamic. I mean, you can't justify that policy. If you justify that policy, then the other side isn't going to listen to you. Similarly, if I'm a Palestinian and I'm talking to somebody who thinks they have a right to expand the settlements into every corner of Judea and Samaria, there's something wrong there too. Um, and we are not encouraging that kind of thinking where people are deplatformed, particularly now, if they express any kind of nuance about what's going on. So, I think that again, it's a failure of the education system and the media, which sort of seems to be unable to handle nuance, to understand dissent. And look, I agree with you totally. That, I mean, DeSantis not so much, but certainly Nikki Haley's statements about the Civil War. I mean, you'd have to be an imbecile. I mean, she doesn't. I don't think she's an imbecile, but she sort of talked like an imbecile in that particular case. Now, I'm sure what she was doing is, oh, I want to protect this group. Well, this is part of the problem we have. People in the Democrats feel that they have to kowtow to every crazy agenda that exists in their party, and the Republicans do the same thing, and it's not healthy for the Republic.
What do you do though? Let's say on the other side. I mean, there's a lot of critique about foreign money and the like, but organizations, let's say like Canary Mission, which is Jewish backed, and they look to dox people who they consider to be anti-Israel. How do you handle a group like that?
Well, I think that, I mean, again, I think political lobbying, whether it's coming from Muslims or from Jews, is part of the process. Um, I mean, certainly, it's most Jewish people are not going to support AOC, um, who is, who has been pretty intemperate on all this stuff. Um, and I wouldn't expect them to. Similarly, I wouldn't expect that a Muslim person would say, hey, you know what? I'm going to give money to candidates who support a particular point of view, are more favorable to the Palestinians. So, but if it's steered into the political realm, at least it's judged somewhat by some sense of rules. Um,
But they do doxing, which is,
I,
and
I
they
think
go
doxing, which has been, really perfected by the left in the last 10 to 20 years. I
right, but that's like saying that Ralph Reed, who was against Saul Alinsky, but has now adopted a lot of his techniques, because Canary Mission does dox people into the point where they tell companies not to hire that person because of this or that, which to me is a form of cancel culture that a lot of
well,
people complain about.
again, cancel culture bequeaths cancel culture.
Hmm.
Um, you support not having Israeli professors speak at schools, you're going to get a response like that. Um, I mean, look, certainly, if I'm a university, do I really want people there who support terrorism, whether it's from West Bank settlers or from Palestinians? I don't want those people around, if I could avoid it, because they're capable of all sorts of things, and they poison the water. But should a university have a more people from different points of view on Israel or any other issue? I think that's fine. Now, if you have somebody who adopts a position that is essentially eliminationist, whether it's from the Jewish side or from the Muslim side, that kind of goes over the line. I don't think they should go to jail, but I'm not so sure I want them teaching my children.
Brings me to the point then, how do you begin to, number one, protect the middle, and what we've been talking about a lot, um, because the extremes are just drowning out everything else.
Right.
From the media perspective, we know that the reason you're not going to get nuance is because it doesn't sell, quite frankly. There's really no profit motive within nuance. Everything has become crossfire. And so, and I have to say, to his credit, even though I disagree with 99% of what Mr. Buckley stood for, his show Firing Line did have on different points of view. And it did it. Now, he had his own snide way of dealing with issues, which he did. But, but he
But
allowed
witty at the same
witty,
time.
yes, acerbic, but witty. But he did have two points of view on. And I did appreciate that. And I think Fred Friendly had some of those lectures later on in his career that were being televised. But quite frankly, unless you make it palatable to profit, I don't know if you'll ever have that opportunity to do what you and I are doing right now. And so the question I
Well,
have to you, you've been around longer. Tell me how this happens
but it's happening right now, isn't it? Between the
with
two
you
of
and I.
us.
Yes.
And, hopefully if people pick up on this and, we'll promote it, I assume you'll promote it, that has some advantage. I'm very pleased by the rise of some new media that are outside of this dynamic. Free press is certainly has some things recommended. Unheard and Spiked in the UK have some very I'll read an article in Unheard and I say, I can't believe they published it. And then the next time I'll read one, I said, that's a great piece. I mean, um, I think I don't think we can count on the existing institutions to do a very good job, particularly, by the way, because if you've been in this business long enough, they're in terrible shape economically. Um, you know, when I first started in journalism, it was a booming industry. You know, people got jobs. They worked for a newspaper for 40 years. They joined the union. They bought a house in the suburbs. You know, that was the way it is. That isn't the way it is now. So new forms have to be here. And what you're doing and what's happening with lots of the podcasts that I've done, and the one I do myself, I think that in those places, reasonable discussion is possible. So I mean, yes, I think the tendencies are bad. Now, I teach a class with a colleague of mine on the social and political implications of artificial intelligence. And what the kids have said to me, and that it's very clear, the social media has algorithms. And so if I read an article by Ralph Reed, I'm going to get Ralph Reed facsimiles, and I'm never going to see anything else. Same thing, if I'm an AOC fan, I'm never going to read about anything that's even in the center. I'm going to just keep, because they want your eyeballs. So there has to be a new model or some alternative model to that. The only good thing I could say is I'm not sure it's working economically long term. I'll give you an example. At a Iranian New Year celebration, my wife and I had a conversation with, this is in 2016, with a guy from CNN. And we asked, well, how come you only have Trump rallies and you don't have rallies from other candidates? He said, because we get good ratings and we know it will get the ratings. Then they decided, well, our ticket is to be the most fanatically anti-Trump outlet. Well, it didn't work out very well for them.
In the minute that we have left in this conversation, you and I both know that college campuses have always been petri dishes for railing against the status quo. But how do you first keep that, because that's good, because there are some things that do need to be
Sure.
changed. Um, but how do you make sure, number one, that whatever the pushback is going to be against, let's say, foreign money coming into colleges and the influx of foreign students, that it doesn't turn into nativism, a form of nativism? But also, how do you get America's leaders to stop going to their prospective corners or the extreme side of their
Yes.
corners and come towards the middle? Because from what I'm seeing, even though I do see people, like we had said before, politicians parroting talking points that are coming out of Russia is troubling for me, as I'm sure it is for you.
Yeah.
So how do you make people like that pay a political price, thereby forcing them to come towards the middle sometimes at the least?
Well, I think, what you would hope is that journalists in particular would do this. Um, and whether it's, somebody who's responding to, pressure from China, which is infinitely more important country than Russia. Um, you don't want to have uh, uh, media that is, overly influenced by whatever country, whether it's Russia, China, Iran. The other thing is, when you asked the question initially, I had this idea that when foreign students come to America, we ought to think about just giving them an orientation on American history, American institutions, very straight ahead, warts and all, but to say, this is what America is about, so that you know why the Electoral College is there, or what its extensive purpose is, why we have a federal system instead of a unitary system. Um, what you know, what were the benefits of the kind of capitalism we have in this country? There are some negative parts, but there's some very positive parts. I taught a class years ago. This is at Pepperdine, must have been 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, maybe more than that, actually, maybe at least 15 or 20. where I had foreign students who were going for their business degrees. And my class was to teach them American economic history and how did the country develop. And I used Charles and Mary Beard's book as the basic textbook because it's beautifully written and at that time would have been considered progressive. Today I don't know what you would think of it, but I think that when these foreign students come here, we should, as part of their orientation, to let them know about American history and how the country developed and why we have certain racial issues and why we have regional issues. Sometimes I find myself trying to explain to people, this is a huge country and there's an enormous distance, both physically and mentally, between somebody who's in Manhattan and somebody who's in West Texas. And there's a huge gap between the person living in inner city Baltimore and somebody who's living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan or in Beverly Hills. And I think that we do a great disservice to ourselves and to the students to not sit down and say, these are sort of the rules that we have. This is how the country got to be. It is whatever the problems that you and I might have with the United States, it's still the most powerful and influential and important country in the world and has been for at least 50 or 60 years, and I would argue maybe even 100 years. So we should say, how did this happen? What was it? And I think one of the key lessons that we would like people to say, yes, when we started off, if you weren't an Anglo-Saxon, you were an outsider. Benjamin Franklin complained. Benjamin Franklin, probably the most enlightened of all the founding fathers, saying, well, why would we want to Germanize the country? Because so many Germans were coming in. And then there was, of course, the prejudice against African Americans and the prejudice against the Italians and against the Irish and against the Jews. But over time, each of those groups found a way into the mainstream, some more imperfectly, but they still did. And that the great advantage of America has been the blending of cultures under a constitutional rubric. That's what makes America great.
My guest today has been Joel Kotkin, the Roger Hobbs Presidential Fellow at Chapman University in California. Joel, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable.
And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.